Today's topic is using motion to measure more than just tracking objects, things like maybe live dead or moving versus static objects in the field of view. And then during this process, I came across the requirement to create some custom expressions in Data Collector, and I thought I'd share that with you today. So here's an example of some objects in motion, and the question came up about what percentage of the objects are in motion, as opposed to, the traditional things that we might measure, like, velocities or accelerations or intensity changes, things like that. Well, the question here was, some of them are moving, some of them are static. What percentage are in motion? Well, if I were to stop let me move this window here just slightly. If I were to stop the motion in order to analyze it, we kind of lose track of which ones are moving and which ones are static. So let's begin the process of trying to come up with a couple of steps that would allow us to make this analysis. So here's another example of another image with objects in motion. Again, some static, some in motion. And again, in addition to the measurements that we normally make, the question might be, well, what percentage of the objects are moving? So here's some other places where I thought that this might be applicable. Any place where there's a time lapse or any motion involved, you can tell the difference. Things like hatchery cultures, where you might have larvae and things like that are just recently born, and some may be alive, which are in motion, and then some may be static. You can do population counts and figure out what percentages. Beehive activities, and then also like in zebrafish population changes, some may die off, and again, there's going to be a certain population which are moving, and then other ones which are static. So anyway, this could be applied as usual with most of these type of applications across many different applications. The other one I thought of was maybe a satellite image of an Air Force field, and maybe certain planes that are parked and some that are in motion. So there's a ton of places where these things can be used. So anyway, the first thing that we do in looking at this kind of a sample is to extract the first frame, and next we take that frame and we store it. The next thing we do is we extract two neighboring frames in a sequence, so maybe frame number 1 and frame number 2, and we apply a process inside of Image Pro called difference. And this will look at the absolute difference only between those two frames, and you get a resultant image in dark pixels and light pixels showing the difference between frame 1 and frame 2. Next, you take that same image that you got that result, and you apply one more difference, and you compare it to the original frame down here in the bottom corner, and you end up with an image that looks like this. So I did use a region of interest on here where I applied the segmentation of two classes just to show you on the right-hand side what the raw image looks like, the result, and then on the left-hand side is the segmented objects. And the dark objects are the static objects, and the white objects are the objects that have moved. So inside of count size, we can measure these objects, these two classes, and we can end up with a lot of information, things like area and size and perimeter and things like that. But the question about, has this object moved or has it not moved, has it static, things like that, can't be answered there. So that requires going to the next step, which is using our data collector that allows you to take data that is currently sitting in our measurement table, and in this case was acquired through count size. I did create two custom segmentation classes, one called moving and one called the total count. So in the final image, after all of my arithmetic calculations of the images, I ended up with one image, and it represents these two classes, represent the total count and just the objects that are only in moving. So within the data table from the count size, we still can't get the percentage of objects that we're moving relative to the total. So like I say, then we take it to the next step. And we can go into our data collector. So within data collector, if you remember, in addition to all these other wonderful measurements and parameters that can be measured, I collected a list of the class index, the segmentation index number, and the class name. And then also I created these unique columns, one being the total count and one being the moving count. And then ultimately what I wanted to do in my data collector is have a percentage of moving object. And so the way I accomplished that is this is the view of the types icon expanded, and we can look at on the right-hand side the custom measurement that was created called total count and moving count. Those are the two individual measurements that are made on the static image. And then we created the measurement called moving percentage. And those are accomplished by clicking on the new icon here in the center. And then what you get when you click on new is this dialog. What this allows you to do is create any type of custom expression. It can be arithmetic, it can be logical, it can be any kind of expression. And you just tell the dialog into which table you would like to have your new measurements show up. You can give the measurement a name, and then you just create the expression here. The expression itself is basically just the total count of the moving objects divided by the total count of the static of the total, and then we get the decimal fraction. We multiply that by 100, and then we get a percentage. So anyway, this is the way we step through it to do it, and now we can take a quick peek inside of Image Pro and take a look at it with the actual images. So the first image here is just the sequence. You can see that the objects are moving, some of them are static. So we'd like to know at any one time what is the percentage of moving versus static. So remember, the first thing we did is we snapped an image. We get a first frame. Next, we take 2 frames from the original and we extract those, any 2 neighboring frames. I took frame 1 and frame 2. And then we look at this. So you can obviously start to see that some of the objects are moving and some of them are static. The next thing is we do a difference. And the difference is found on the Process tab here, and it's down here. We can do things like subsample, look at difference, take an average, motion detect, things like that. So I used this function called difference, and I looked at the difference, the absolute difference between these 2 frames. And it results in dark objects and lighter objects. The light represents the place to which the object moved. Next, we do the exact same thing, and we compare this image against the original image back here, and that results in this final difference image here. And this has already been segmented here, where the green classification are the total number of objects, and the blue is the objects that have moved. And again, in our count size data table down here, we can get the number, and of course we could export this out to Excel, and then in Excel do a custom calculation in Excel to come up with the percentage that are moving. But since we do have data collector within Image Pro, we can do that here also. So under the types, this is again where we created that. I went into the measurement class statistics and created these 2 new measurements here. And again, it's done by clicking on the new icon here. But once they're here, I can go into edit and just look at them here also. So this describes the column creation of the first class, and it's the region area count. So this happens, my class 1 happens to be the moving object, and then class 2 is the total. So I created this object and this object here, and then in the end, the ultimate goal was to create a percentage. And so this one here represents the calculation of the expression of taking the moving object's total count and dividing it by the absolute total count and multiplying by 100. And so if we do that and we actually collect that into our data collector table, I can look down here at my data collector table, and here's my statistics, my class statistics, and here's my total count, and here's my moving objects. And if I look at the statistics window, I get the actual percentage. So this would be the table that it could potentially take a whole folder full of images, which are track sequences, and apply this analysis, and you'd end up with a single line summary of the percentage of objects that are moving versus static. So anyway, hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions about this or any of the other features or functions within ImagePro, just be sure to get back to your local partner or ask anybody in the Tech Services Department at Media Cybernetics.